They said the King Tiger was unstoppable, a monster of steel that ruled the battlefield. But when American soldiers finally got their hands on one, they discovered a truth the Nazis never wanted the world to know. The King of Tanks was dying before it ever reached the fight. July 1944, somewhere near the ruins of Villers-Bocage, France. The war had reached a fever pitch. Dust, smoke, and the echo of artillery hung over every field. The Allies were pushing forward, their Shermans grinding through mud and blood. And yet, in every whisper, one name sent a chill down every spine. Tiger. The Tiger I had already become legend, but rumors spoke of something worse. A newer, deadlier machine. A tank so powerful, so impenetrable, that German crews called it Königstiger, the King Tiger. Most Allied troops thought it was just propaganda. Until one morning, scouts reported something strange. A massive, abandoned tank blocking a narrow country road. It wasn't burning. It wasn't destroyed. It had simply stopped. When the Americans arrived, they saw it. And for a long moment, no one spoke. The machine looked almost alien, towering nearly 11 feet high, its armor thick enough to shrug off anything short of a naval gun. The sun reflected off its curved turret, and the long 88mm gun stretched like a spear into the air. It looked invincible. Private Jack Morrison, a tanker from the 3rd Armored Division, whispered, "That thing's a damn battleship on tracks." Sergeant Bill Carver circled it cautiously, M1 slung over his shoulder. "If this thing really worked," he muttered, "we'd all be dead." The crew could see no shell holes, no burn marks. The tank was intact, and that was the strangest part. The hatches were open, no sign of the crew. The tracks had sunk deep into the earth, as if it had just died there. Carver climbed up, pulled the hatch open further, and peered inside. The smell hit him first, oil, smoke, and something else, electrical burning. Inside, wires were fried. Gear levers jammed. The massive gearbox shattered. "Transmissions blown," said their mechanic, Specialist Avery. "She didn't die from battle. She killed herself." That was the first shock. The so-called invincible tank had crippled itself before ever firing a shot. They decided to tow it back to base. It took 3 Shermans and a heavy recovery vehicle just to move it a few miles. The entire time, soldiers walked beside it, staring like they were escorting a sleeping giant. At the maintenance yard, engineers swarmed the King Tiger. They wanted answers. They wanted to know how this myth of Nazi engineering had failed so completely. They stripped it piece by piece, the armor, the gears, the turret systems. What they found left them speechless. The armor, yes, it was thick, unbelievably thick. The Americans tried firing a 75mm shell at it. The round bounced off like a pebble. But inside, it was chaos. The internal design was overcomplicated, hundreds of delicate components, thin wires and fragile fittings. The gearbox, massive and intricate, was barely capable of handling the tank's own weight. It was German precision taken to an extreme, too perfect to survive war. One of the American engineers, Lieutenant Robert Hale, stared at the open engine bay and shook his head. "They built a masterpiece," he said, "but forgot it had to live in hell." The Tiger II's engine, the same Maybach that powered smaller tanks, was being forced to move nearly 70 tons of armor. It overheated within minutes, its gears screaming under pressure. The transmission couldn't handle the torque. Every time the tank tried to climb a hill or turn sharply, it risked destroying itself from within. The soldiers who'd first found it hadn't just stumbled upon an abandoned vehicle. They'd discovered the fatal flaw of Nazi engineering: brilliance without practicality. But even broken, the King Tiger inspired awe. Standing beside it, American tankers couldn't help but feel small, as if they were looking at something beyond their own time. The sloped armor, the commander's cupola, the sheer bulk. It was intimidating. Carver tapped the steel with his knuckles. "You hit this thing with a Sherman, and you're just making it angry." The Americans realized that in open combat, the Tiger II could destroy them long before they were close enough to fight back. But that didn't matter if the beast couldn't even reach the battlefield. The German obsession with perfection had birthed a monster, one too fragile to survive its own power. As engineers continued their inspection, they uncovered more haunting details. The tracks were nearly impossible to replace in the field. Each link weighed over 75 pounds. If one broke, it could take an entire crew hours just to fix. The fuel system guzzled gasoline so fast that even if it ran perfectly, it couldn't go more than 60 miles on a full tank. To make matters worse, Germany was already running out of fuel by 1944. So even when these tanks worked, they often had nowhere to go. And yet, the propaganda never stopped. Posters in Berlin called the King Tiger the shield of the Reich. Radio broadcasts boasted of its invincibility. But out in the fields of France, those same tanks sat stranded, abandoned by their own design. That night, as the engineers rested, Sergeant Carver stayed behind. He climbed back up on the Tiger's hull, flashlight in hand. He looked at the driver's seat, empty. He imagined the German crew, terrified, perhaps realizing their tank was dying as Allied shells thundered closer. Maybe they fled into the woods, leaving their king behind. He muttered softly, "Guess even kings bleed when they're built wrong." Outside, the night was quiet. But across the camp, soldiers gathered around fires, whispering about what they'd seen. The legend of the King Tiger was starting to change, from fearsome war machine to tragic failure. A machine that looked unstoppable, but broke under its own weight. In the following days, the Americans ran more tests. They drove the tank a few yards under supervision. The engine growled, the gears clanked, and then, with a screech, it seized again. The smell of burning oil filled the air. "Same problem," muttered one engineer. "Final drives cooked." That failure, the final drive, would become infamous. Every captured Tiger II the Allies tested failed the same way. After just a few miles, the gears would shear apart under stress. To the Americans, it was a revelation. Germany had poured millions of marks into creating the most powerful tank in history, and built a machine that could destroy itself faster than any enemy could. When the report reached higher command, the reaction was mixed. Some officers laughed. Others warned not to underestimate the beast. General Patton himself reportedly said, "If the Germans ever fix that damn thing, we'll be in trouble." But deep down, the truth was clear. The Tiger II was a monument to hubris, a reminder that perfection means nothing if it can't endure imperfection. As the sun set over the French countryside, the massive tank stood silent once again. Its gun pointed toward the horizon, as if still ready to fight a war it could never win. For the men who'd captured it, it became more than just a trophy. It was a lesson carved in steel. War wasn't about who built the prettiest weapon. It was about who could keep theirs running when everything else fell apart. And in that lesson, the Americans found their real victory. August 1944, Allied testing grounds, somewhere outside St. Lo, France. The captured King Tiger sat in the middle of a wide dirt field, surrounded by engineers, tank crews, and military photographers. The air buzzed with anticipation. For weeks, rumors had spread through the ranks. Soldiers whispered that the Americans were about to bring a Nazi monster back to life. The King Tiger, the invincible beast that broke before battle, was about to roar again. A team of mechanics worked tirelessly under the summer sun. They had replaced the transmission bearings, rewired the ignition, and cleaned the massive Maybach HL-230 engine until it gleamed. Now came the moment of truth. Lieutenant Robert Hale stood with a clipboard, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. Beside him, Sergeant Bill Carver, the man who had first discovered the tank, crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on the hulking machine. "All right, boys," Hale said, voice steady. "Let's wake the king." A mechanic climbed inside, turned the ignition. Click. Nothing. He tried again. Click. Whir. Clank. The engine coughed once, belched black smoke, then fell silent. Everyone waited. Then a roar. The Maybach engine came alive, rattling the ground. Thick smoke poured from the rear exhausts. The machine shook like a living creature finally breathing again after months of death. The soldiers cheered, some clapping, others just staring in awe. But Lieutenant Hale didn't smile. He knew how fragile this thing was. He scribbled something in his notes. "Engine sounds rough. Watch temperature closely. Minutes later, the test began. The King Tiger rolled forward, slowly at first, its heavy tracks chewing through the dirt. Even in motion, it felt unnatural, like watching a steel cathedral move on wheels. "Goddamn," murmured Private Morrison. "She moves like a mountain." For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. The tank advanced down the field, turned, and began climbing a small hill. But halfway up, a horrible sound tore through the air. A deep metallic grind, followed by a sharp bang. The tank lurched to a stop. Steam hissed from the engine deck. The crew inside shouted something, then silence. Lieutenant Hale rushed forward. "Cut the power. Shut it down." By the time the mechanics reached the back, oil was already leaking across the dirt. One of the engineers looked up, face pale. "Final drive's gone, sir." Again, the same failure. The same fatal weakness that had killed the King Tiger on the battlefield. When the crew opened the rear compartment, the smell hit everyone. Burning oil and shattered steel. The massive gears inside the final drive housing were stripped bare, their teeth ground down to smooth metal. The King Tiger once again had destroyed itself. Sergeant Carver kicked the side of the tank in frustration. All that armor, all that power, and it can't even turn its own damn wheels. Lieutenant Hale just nodded slowly. He wasn't angry, he was fascinated. This wasn't just a broken machine. It was a story, a confession written in steel. He called over his assistant. "Bring the German manuals," he said. "I want to know exactly how this thing was supposed to work." That night, under the dim glow of lanterns, Hale and his team spread out the captured documents, schematics, blueprints, and field reports from German tank divisions. Most were stamped Panzerabteilung 503, the same unit that had first deployed the Tiger II in Normandy. As they translated the reports, a pattern began to emerge. One report read, "Frequent mechanical breakdowns during road marches. Final drives overheat. Transmission failure at 150 kilometers." Another said, "Average operational lifespan of vehicle. Less than 12 hours of combat movement." The engineers looked at each other in disbelief. This wasn't an isolated issue. It was systemic. The King Tiger wasn't a war machine, it was a mechanical time bomb. Over the next week, Hale ordered a series of tests to understand why. They began measuring internal temperatures during operation. Within 10 minutes of movement, the engine temperature spiked to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously high. Fuel efficiency was abysmal. The tank burned through 30 gallons of fuel in under 10 miles. Worse, the transmission was so complex that any misalignment caused catastrophic stress on the gears. Every time the tank turned sharply, the right side drive system bore too much torque, and the final drive sheared again. "It's like they built a lion," one mechanic said, "and gave it the heart of a kitten." Meanwhile, soldiers passing through the camp would stop and stare at the immobilized tank. To them, it was still a terrifying sight. The gun barrel alone looked longer than a Sherman. Some even posed for photos beside it, grinning nervously, as if taking a picture with death itself. But the engineers knew better now. The King Tiger's armor was its own curse. Its 69-ton weight destroyed roads, bridges, and itself. Its massive 88mm cannon, though devastating, made the turret so heavy that it often jammed during firing tests. And when the Americans simulated battle conditions, adding mud, water, and rough terrain, the tank barely moved 500 yards before stalling. Yet, for all its flaws, no one could deny the majesty of its construction. Every weld, every plate, every mechanism was crafted with the kind of precision only German industry could produce. But that precision came at a terrible price. Where the Americans valued reliability and mass production, the Germans worshipped perfection. They built works of art instead of tools for war. And art doesn't survive the battlefield. Lieutenant Hale decided to write an official assessment for Allied High Command. He sat at his desk that night, cigarette smoke curling through the lamplight, and began to write. The Tiger II represents the pinnacle of German armored design in theory, but in practice, it is a failure of military engineering. Its mechanical complexity far exceeds its battlefield utility. It is not a weapon of war. It is a monument to arrogance. When he was done, he folded the report and handed it to Sergeant Carver. Carver read the first few lines and smirked. Guess the king didn't have much of a crown after all. But for some reason, Hale couldn't let it go. He found himself visiting the tank late at night, standing beside it in the moonlight. The massive silhouette loomed against the stars, silent and cold. He placed a hand on its side, feeling the rough steel under his palm. In that moment, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt tragic. A monument to human pride, built by men who believed they could outthink nature itself. In the coming weeks, American intelligence began collecting more reports of abandoned or destroyed Tiger IIs across France and Belgium. Almost all told the same story. Most were lost not to enemy fire, but to breakdowns, fuel shortages, or self-destruction. Crews often sabotaged their own tanks to prevent capture, setting them ablaze before fleeing on foot. The Germans had created a king so heavy it could not rule its own kingdom. One morning, Hale received an order. The captured Tiger II was to be shipped to England for further study. He and his team watched as cranes lifted the massive tank onto a transport truck. The ground shook under its weight. Carver sighed. So that's it, huh? Off to London. Maybe they'll fix it. Hale shook his head. No. They'll just confirm what we already know. The convoy began to move, dust swirling behind it as the King Tiger disappeared down the road, the last time any of them would ever see it again. In London, British engineers ran their own tests. They too found the same failures: overheating, cracked drives, impossible maintenance times. One British officer summed it up best in his final evaluation. The Tiger II is a weapon that could have changed the war, if the war had been fought on paper. Months later, Lieutenant Hale returned home, but he could never forget the sight of that tank. Sitting silent in the field, massive and proud, dying under its own ambition. Sometimes he'd tell the story to new recruits, not as a tale of triumph, but as a warning. The enemy's greatest weapon, he'd say, wasn't their tanks, it was their arrogance. And every time he said it, he could still hear that sound. The screech of metal, the final death cry of the King Tiger. December 1944. A cold London morning. Fog rolled over the Thames like a ghost. And through that fog came a convoy of trucks, carrying something enormous, wrapped in canvas, chained down with steel. At the head of the column, an American escort jeep led the way, headlights slicing through the mist. Behind them, British soldiers watched from bridges and rooftops as the silhouette passed beneath. A shape too big, too angular to be anything ordinary. They whispered to each other, "That's the German King Tiger, isn't it? Bloody hell, it's real." The tank arrived at the Royal Ordnance Experimental Grounds in Shoeburyness, a secretive testing site where captured enemy weapons came to be studied, dismantled, and understood. The gate guards didn't salute. They just stared as the crane lowered the 69-ton monster onto British soil. It groaned like an old god being laid to rest. Inside the testing hangar, a small team of British engineers stood waiting. Among them was Major Andrew Collins, head of armored research. He had read every intelligence report, every rumor, every terrified account of this machine's power. But seeing it in person, the size, the thickness of the armor, the sheer presence, made even him take a step back. He turned to the American officer beside him, Lieutenant Robert Hale, who had accompanied the tank from France. "Well, Lieutenant," Collins said quietly, "you've brought us quite a beast."
Hale nodded.
"A beast, yes, but one that eats itself alive." Collins smiled faintly. "Then let's see what made it choke." For the next several weeks, British and American engineers worked side by side in the freezing hangar. They called it Operation Dissect. Each morning, the hangar doors would groan open, and the team would gather, clipboards ready, oil-stained gloves pulled tight. They started by stripping the tank bare. Panels came off, turret lifted away, gears exposed. Every component was catalogued, weighed, and photographed, and what they found inside left them speechless. The armor was astonishing. 8 inches thick in some places, carefully angled, precision welded. The quality of the steel was near perfection: uniform grain, flawless density. One engineer ran his hand over the exposed plate and muttered, "You could drop a shell on this and it'd bounce." But the deeper they went, the more contradictions they uncovered. Behind that perfect armor, chaos lurked. Poorly routed wiring, overcomplicated hydraulics, bolts stripped bare from overtorque. Half the grease fittings were missing entirely. The British lead mechanic, Sergeant Finch, shook his head. It's like they built a cathedral with the plumbing of a barn. Next came the engine, the famous Maybach HL230. On paper, it was a marvel. 700 horsepower, 12-cylinder gasoline engine, meticulously engineered. In practice, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The air filters were tiny, choking the engine in dust. The fuel pump leaked under pressure, and the cooling fans couldn't keep up with the weight of the tank. After hours of inspection, Collins summarized it perfectly in his notebook. Magnificent over-engineering, fatally impractical. They moved on to the transmission. This was where the real heart of the problem lived. To power such a massive machine, the Germans had designed a complex planetary gear system that required almost surgical precision to function. But on the battlefield, with mud, cold, and rushed production, that precision was impossible. Collins pointed to a cracked gear housing. "See this?" he said to Hale. "They didn't harden the teeth enough. It's supposed to take 18 tons of torque, but it's failing at 12. Hale scribbled in his notes. "So the bigger they made it, the faster it died." Collins nodded grimly. "Exactly." Over tea breaks, the men often talked quietly about the irony of it all. The Germans had spent fortunes creating a perfect machine that couldn't survive its own perfection. And across the channel, American factories were spitting out Shermans by the thousands. Tanks that broke down got repaired and went right back to fighting. It was two philosophies at war: perfection versus production. And now, with the King Tiger laid open like a skeleton, the winner was obvious. One night, long after the others had gone, Hale stayed behind in the hangar. The wind howled outside, rattling the steel doors. He stood under a single work light, staring at the stripped hull of the Tiger. He walked closer, running his hand along the rough, battle-scarred metal. Bullet marks, gouges, weld scars. It was beautiful and broken all at once. He whispered under his breath, "You were too good for your own side, weren't you?" The next morning they began firing tests. British gunners brought in 17-pounder shells, the same type used by their Sherman Fireflies. The idea was simple: find out just how invincible this thing really was. The first shot hit the lower glacis. The shell ricocheted, sparking like lightning. The second hit at an angle, same result. But the third, fired from close range, penetrated the thinner side armor. A deafening explosion of sparks and smoke. When the dust cleared, the engineers saw the hole. It was small, but it was there. Major Collins turned to Hale. "So much for invincible." Hale smiled slightly. "Everyone bleeds somewhere." After a month of testing, both nations compiled their findings. The joint report was titled, Technical Analysis of Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausf. B. SD. KFZ. 182. But everyone in the building knew it by its nickname, the King's Autopsy. The report's conclusion stunned military planners. The Tiger II possesses unparalleled armor protection and firepower. However, its weight and mechanical unreliability render it unsuitable for sustained operations. Its complexity exceeds the capacity of field maintenance. In other words, it was unbeatable until it moved. But even in failure, the King Tiger had lessons to teach. American engineers studying the wreck took pages of notes, not on how to copy it, but how not to. Asterisk. They admired its gun stabilization system, its optics, its efficient crew layout. But they saw the price of excess. And when they began designing the M26 Pershing, America's answer to heavy armor, they used what they'd learned. The Pershing's designers focused on balance. Strength without fragility, power without perfectionism. And that philosophy became the foundation for the next generation of tanks. The M46 Patton, the M48, and beyond. The Tiger II had lost the war, but it had shaped the peace. As 1945 dawned, London burned again, this time with anticipation. The Allies were preparing for the final push into Germany. Hale stood on a balcony overlooking the Thames, holding a copy of the report in his hands. The last line caught his eye. The Tiger II is a monument, not to victory, but to obsession. He folded the paper, tucked it in his jacket, and walked away. Back in Shoeburyness, the Tiger's carcass remained. Its turret sat beside the hull, its gears rusting quietly in the cold. Workers came and went, indifferent now. It was just another piece of war junk. But for a few who had seen it alive, it was more than that. It was the ghost of an empire that thought it could build its way to immortality. Months later, after Germany's surrender, Hale visited a captured factory in Kassel, where surviving German engineers had once built these very tanks. He found an old man there sweeping the floor, a former designer named Erich Baumann. Through a translator, Hale asked him, "Why build something you knew couldn't last?" Baumann stopped sweeping. He looked up, eyes tired, and said softly, "Because we were told to build fear, not tanks." Hale didn't reply. He just stared at the man and finally understood. The King Tiger wasn't a weapon. It was propaganda in steel, a symbol built to intimidate enemies and comfort a dying regime. It was never meant to survive, only to impress. When Hale returned to America that summer, he carried the King Tiger story with him. In lectures, he told young engineers and cadets the same thing every time. Perfection is seductive. But war doesn't reward perfection. It rewards persistence. And every time he said it, he saw flashes of the Tiger in his mind. Roaring, breaking, dying under its own weight. Years later, one of those engineers who heard Hale's lectures would help design the M60 Patton. And when asked why it was built with simple, rugged systems instead of fancy mechanics, he smiled and said, "Because I remember the King Tiger." The last remaining operational Tiger II was shipped to Bovington Camp, England, where it still sits today, silent and heavy, under museum lights. Tourists walk past it, children stare, veterans shake their heads. Few know the full story, that this beast of iron and fire was undone not by Allied guns, but by human ego. And in the quiet halls of that museum, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the slow creak of gears, the sigh of the king remembering the war it never truly fought. At the American testing ground in France, engineers, mechanics, and tank officers gathered around the captured Tiger II, what they called the Beast. Its engine bay was open, armor panels removed, tracks laid out like the remains of a giant predator dissected on an autopsy table. Major William Knox, head of the evaluation team, wiped grease from his hands and muttered, "She's beautiful, but she's broken in all the ways that matter." The others nodded. The first thing they'd noticed was the sheer weight, nearly 70 tons. The Tiger II was so heavy it crushed roads not built for it, bridges it was meant to cross, and even its own mechanical systems under stress. The final drive, the Achilles heel of German design, had failed catastrophically after barely 100 kilometers of movement. The gears were shattered, metal ground into dust. Knox ran his finger along one of the destroyed cogs and said, "You can't fight a war when your tanks kill themselves before the enemy does." One of the engineers, a man who had spent 2 years maintaining Shermans in the mud of Normandy, laughed softly. "All that armor, all that power, and it dies on its own gearbox. Hell of a way to lose a war." The Americans decided to do what any curious soldier would: start the engine. After several attempts, the Maybach HL-230P30 engine sputtered to life, coughing smoke like an old dragon waking from sleep. The ground trembled. Everyone stepped back as the monstrous engine roared, filling the hangar with noise and fumes. For a moment, everyone felt the raw power of German engineering. But within minutes, the engine began to overheat. Oil leaked from joints, the clutch stuck, and then a loud metallic crack echoed through the hangar. The engine seized. Knox didn't even flinch. "And there's your miracle machine," he said. "A monument to over-engineering." Later that week, they conducted firing tests. A captured King Tiger turret was placed on a mock range. American 76mm shells from a Sherman bounced off the front glacis, just as expected. The Tiger's armor was nearly invincible from the front, sloped, thick, and perfectly welded. But when they hit the sides, something surprising happened. The armor cracked. Not penetrated, cracked. The metallurgical team later confirmed what few expected. Germany's late-war steel had deteriorated. Nickel and molybdenum, essential for toughness, were running short due to Allied bombing and blockades. What remained was brittle, poorly tempered metal. One shot to the turret ring caused a fracture that spread like a spider web. Knox stared at it, shaking his head. Strong where it doesn't need to be. Weak where it matters most. He looked over at his own Sherman sitting nearby. Smaller, thinner, simpler. "She's no beauty," he said. "But she gets us home." For months, German propaganda had painted the Tiger II as unstoppable. A machine that could turn back the tide of war. But the Americans saw it differently now. Yes, the King Tiger could destroy anything it faced if it got to the fight. But most of the time it didn't. Broken gearboxes, empty fuel tanks, engines catching fire, crews abandoning them before even seeing an enemy. In field reports, American reconnaissance units often found Tiger IIs destroyed by their own men, blown up to prevent capture after yet another breakdown. To the American tankers, it wasn't a symbol of fear anymore. It was a tragic trophy, a weapon so mighty it destroyed its own masters. The Americans were fascinated by the machine's complexity. They brought in mechanical experts from Detroit, men who had built Fords and Packards, to analyze the design. Their verdict was simple. This thing was made by artists, not soldiers. Every component, from the interlocking road wheels to the gearbox, was beautifully crafted, but required impossible precision. It wasn't designed for war. It was designed for perfection. Knox wrote in his report, "A Sherman can be built in a day. A Tiger takes months. That's the difference between victory and defeat." He sent that line up the chain of command. Months later, it would appear in an internal memo at the Ordnance Department, cited as proof that simplicity wins wars, not elegance. Among the Americans who had captured the Tiger was Sergeant Henry Doyle, the same man who had been in the M4 that watched it break down. Weeks later, he was invited to see it again at the testing site. He stood in front of it silently, helmet in hand. To him, it wasn't just a machine, it was a ghost. He remembered the first time he saw one, in the hedgerows near St. Lo. The gunfire, the smell, the fear, and then the silence when it stopped moving. Now, standing inches away, he felt something almost like pity. "They built her like she was meant to live forever," he said. "But forever doesn't mean much when your fuel runs out." Knox looked at him and nodded. "That's war, Sergeant. The best machine doesn't win. The best machine for the war does." When the war ended, the King Tiger became a museum piece, studied by engineers, admired by historians, and worshipped by enthusiasts who never had to fight it. In one final report, the U.S. Army wrote, "The Tiger II represents the pinnacle of German tank design and the inevitable collapse of its philosophy. Power without practicality, armor without endurance, and fear without function." It was a warning not just to Germany, but to every nation that would build weapons in the decades to come. Back in Germany, a captured engineer named Kurt Zimmermann was interrogated about the Tiger II's failures. He was proud, even defiant. "It was the finest tank ever built," he insisted. The American officer smiled. "Then why did it die before reaching the fight?" Zimmermann's voice cracked. "Because we forgot that war isn't about perfection. It's about persistence." That sentence stayed with the officer for years, even long after the Cold War began, long after new tanks replaced the old. The King Tiger became more than a tank. It became a lesson, a monument to what happens when brilliance ignores reality. Decades later, when the world had changed and the guns had fallen silent, an old film reel was discovered in a dusty Army archive. On it was grainy footage, an American crew laughing beside the captured Tiger, its turret jammed, engine smoking. Someone off camera could be heard saying, "Guess the King didn't make it to the party." And then silence. The reel cut to black, and the myth of the invincible Tiger faded with it. Because in the end, It wasn't destroyed by American shells. It was destroyed by German pride. They called it the King Tiger, a machine of terror, built to crush anything in its path. But power built on arrogance always breaks from within. The Americans didn't need to outgun it. They only had to outlast it. And in the quiet after the war, the world learned a simple truth, that the greatest weapon is not the one that looks unstoppable, but the one that keeps moving when everything else stops.